you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And there's a lot of people in here that do understand the history and lived through the history of our Great Lakes and the industrialization mistakes that we made, starting in 1919 and the industrial polluting that we were doing by keeping shipping channels clear. And that was done with the consent and the help of the Army Corps of Engineers as they would dredge out the spoilage in places like the Buffalo River and the Cuyahoga River in Ohio and other places across the Great Lakes, and take this spoilage, this industrial dreck, and dump it into the open waters of the Great Lakes with the notion that, well, the solution to pollution is dilution, and with 8 quadrillion gallons in the Great Lakes systems, there's going to be no way we're going to ever poison ourselves. But in 1970, the Lake Erie that we have today was declared dead. And I know that a lot of people who are in here remember those dark days. And this is where we get our drinking water from. We didn't have any fish. We didn't have any business along the shoreline because of insects that were left unchecked. We had stinky water, and it was poisonous. It was poisonous. But the dumping was stopped back in 1968 after the efforts of a gentleman by the name of Stanley Spiesiak, who happened to be the president of the Erie County Conservation Alliance, an organization that I serve to this day. He tirelessly fought against it, and in 1968 he won the battle with the Great Lakes Protection Act that was the predecessor for the 1972 Clean Air and Clean Water Acts that also brought about the EPA. And the EPA identified 362 different chemical contaminants that are out on the beds of each one of these Great Lakes, with 17 of them actually studied for human impacts and health impacts on the wildlife and the fisheries. These chemical contaminants are pretty much forever contaminants. They're down and they're covered on the bottom of Lake Erie because of a sand cap. Due to geology and a stroke of luck for that lake, it is only 210 feet deep. The other 4 Great Lakes have this stuff that will be forever exposed and forever getting into the food chain and into the drinking water. But over the last 50 plus years, a sand cap has covered this stuff, and it is no longer exposing to the food chain, to the point where back in 2011 or 2012, I believe it was, the New York State Department of Health updated their health advisories to eating fish out of Lake Erie. And from eat none, don't even touch them, to now where you can eat a meal a month, or a meal a week, 8 ounces of fish every week you can eat from that lake, which is the same recommendation that you get from store-bought fish that's harvested commercially out in the oceans. That's a testament. That is huge. But that doesn't mean those contaminants have suddenly disappeared. They're just buried out there. Some of those contaminants in the predominant contaminant in Lake Erie consist of PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which is fat-soluble industrial contaminants that cause cancer, inhibits hormonal regulation, and reproductive problems. In addition, we have murex, dioxins, phenols, cyanides, heavy metals, pesticides, oils, fats, and greases cheaply from effluents, not from oil wells or leaky pipelines, although accidents in shipping and poorly dysregulated vessels were noted back in 1970. Some of these contaminants, like arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and cobalt, exist in trace amounts. You can barely detect them. However, these toxins bioaccumulate over time, and they have been found to biomagnify as they work their way up the food chain. In addition to these known chemical contaminants, there are emerging contaminants that have just started being studied. Just started being studied means starting in year 2000. These are predominantly known as PFAS chemicals, or polyfluoral perfluoral alkyl substances. We are just really learning that these also are forever chemicals. There are over 400 different chemical compounds in this family that are known to be water soluble. They've been in use since 1940, and they've been extensively used to make some plastics, dyes and paints, food wrapper packages, waterproofing substances, pizza boxes, non-stick cookware, and even Post-it notes and some paper products, as well as firefighting substances like aqueous film-forming foam, when there's a big lawsuit going on right now because of the exposure to that product. These chemical substances, again, have been under study since year 2000, and the dangers are summed up very well in a documentary from 2019 called Dark Waters, which was a case about DuPont Chemical Corporation and how they hid the problems from the public. I recommend everybody view that. These substances were responsible for shutting down the village of Mayville's water supply at the end of December of 2020. They had 3 artesian wells that were detected to have PFAS chemical contamination, and the only solution was to dig a 4th well. And that restored the water supply. Again, they're forever chemicals. Once they're there forever. The contamination was traced back to the Fire Training Academy not too far down the road. And these PFAS substances are carried by rainwater. They bioaccumulate. It will actually evaporate and be carried by the clouds and to drop on another area unsuspecting of that contamination. Over 11 million people depend on Lake Erie for their water, both here in the United States and Canada alone. And I don't believe re-exposing those chemical contaminants would be very wise. But that's not the only chemical contaminants that would be introduced or reintroduced, because as was mentioned earlier, these wind turbines, as we learn more about them on land, bring their whole new set of chemical contaminants that will be present in our water. Let's start about leading edge erosion on those blades. Just by normal wear and tear of the rainwater hitting it and grit that's in the air itself, it sheds what's known as a substance called bisphenol A. And bisphenol A is a major component in industrial epoxies, which is made up of these wind turbines to keep them light and take that carbon fiber and put them together. Bisphenol A is a known endocrine inhibitor. And it has, just insidious effects that impact reproductive viability, not only in people, but also in fish. And in fish, studies have indicated that the problems are generational. It's not just an individual impact. Although the half-life for bisphenol A in air is only 0.2 days, when it's in the water, it lasts darn near forever. That will be introduced into the water. Additionally, you've got these massive permanent magnets that are made of a rare earth metal called neodymium. And studies in France have shown that this neodymium, which is being shed as the turbines spin, the erosion, the natural erosion, is putting this rare earth metal out into the environment. They're finding it in animal hair and in people hair and in the plants, and it's being ingested. Now, neodymium is something that is regulated by OSHA, because when it gets into skin contact, it creates a rash. It's a very big irritant in people. So OSHA has said, if you have a factory that's dealing with neodymium, you have to provide protective equipment for the people. I wonder what happens to it when it gets inside your lungs, or you actually ingest it. That's something that they're not going to look at. They're not even wanting to look at it. They're not interested in it at all. Now, how about the wind turbines, obviously holding petroleum and lubricants, up to 400 gallons of fossil fuels. And we know that 1 tablespoon of water can, poison and contaminate a battleship's water supply. We learned that in World War II. These things, will require annual oil changes. Just like, your vehicle needs it every 3,000 miles. You have to change that liquid out and put new stuff in. Otherwise, the viscosity is lost and you're going to have seized nacelles. Over time, the gaskets deteriorate just like anything else, and they cause leaking problems that will leak right into the waters of life. How about de-icing? We know that ice is a big-time problem, and when the blades get iced over, they can't turn. For a good lesson on that, let's look back in February in the state of Texas, and they came 4 minutes within a brownout because of iced blades. They can't turn. So how are we going to de-ice them? Are we going to go out there with a helicopter and spray hot water on them, which doesn't last very long and costs a tremendous amount of money? Are we going to build in a de-icing system that will basically, when that is working and those heat coils in those blades themselves are melting that water, well, that's going to basically eat up every last kilowatt of energy that's generated. That's going to result in nothing coming off of it, if the wind is blowing at all. How about we use glycol, aircraft de-icer? Well, that's fossil fuels, and we know exactly how poisonous that is. You don't want your dogs getting into antifreeze, which is exactly what it is. and they're going to put that in the water. They haven't addressed any of that. There's also physical pollution, and the Bureau of Oceanic Energy Management has just started soliciting studies to see how the hydrodynamics are going to be changed from New Jersey down to North Carolina, and how it's going to impact larval lobster, how it's going to impact fish fry, how it's going to impact the spawning. All of this stuff is now just starting to come to light, like Shazam. We're going to put something out there, it's actually going to change the current? Well, that's physics. You know, marine physics showed that back in the 70s, when the bridge was built down in the south end of Chautauqua Lake, the Veterans Memorial Bridge, it altered the fishery down on the south end forever. Whether it was good or bad is, something that's up for debate. But it's going to alter the currents, how the plankton is moving, how the oxygen is mixed, and it's also going to create an erosion effect around those particular stanchions that is going to continually reintroduce toxins. Never mind the trenching of the transmission lines coming from each and every one of them. That's going to do a big problem. And oh, by the way, did I mention that this is an international waterway? And the international waterway is actually governed by the International Joint Commission based on a treaty in 1909. Now, New York may own the lake bottom, but we don't own the water. How are they going to get around that? Canada already has a moratorium on this stuff, and they're already saber-rattling over the Ohio project that continually gets stalled. I wonder what's going to happen here. Is Canada going to have to sue us to stop this, or are we going to let wisdom take its course? Then you have acoustic pollution. And due to the fate of engineering, these monstrosities emit what's known as low-frequency noise, also called infrasound. That's a weapon of war from the U.S. military classifications. Back in the 1990s, the early 90s, when the United States Navy started testing their low-frequency active sonar on their submarine fleet, which detects the new modern stealth-running submarines, they found all sorts of problems that were happening to whales. Right whales, humpback whales, beaked whales. They were getting hit by this, and it was completely disorienting them and throwing them into a tizzy, allowing them to not know where they were headed, and they beached themselves. Over the course of time, we have discovered that this low-frequency noise, when it's introduced to a population of fish, it just doesn't end when it shuts off. In fact, when there's no spatial escape, fish will actually inhibit or exhibit the behavior of not knowing what's around them because their number one sense is hearing. Yes, they do have ears. They're located behind the base of the skull. The consensus from Jacques Cousteau saying that fish were deaf, they had no ears, was wrong. It lasts up to 14 days of disorientation post-stimuli removal. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with a 4 megawatt turbine, which is what they're suggesting for Lake Erie, but a study done in 2006 off the North Atlantic coast on a wind factory Alpha, Germany, showed that operational noise from these wind turbines impacts these fish that have a fully gas-filled swim bladder. This was the Atlantic cod, up to 3.5 miles away from an operational turbine. What it does is it masks their surroundings. They can't tell predator from prey. They don't know where they're going. And are they going to just sit there and take it, or are they going to do what everything wants to do, and that's practice avoidance? What is that going to do to the walleye that migrate? What is it going to do to the perch? Now, the trout and salmon, because they have a partially gas-filled swim bladder, is certainly going to be impacted less, but we've got a lot of migrating trout. And we just found that we've got, for the first time down in Barcelona, since the restoration efforts on the lake trout have been happening, actual natural reproduction. Are we going to let that happen and let that be jeopardized? Now, the construction alone, the pounding and the noise that's going to be generated can create a 50-kilometer disturbance area, or 30 miles. Folks, Lake Erie is simply too small to sustain that. It's only 237 miles long and 56 miles wide. That's going to spill into Canada, and it's going to impact their sport fishery too. That doesn't sound very wise to me. Obviously, you also have the problem with radar and influencing that for both border protection and weather forecasting. And you also have some of the effects of electromagnetic frequency pollution that'll be surrounding this particular transmission lines. And what that is being done to the benthic community on land with earthworms and in the waters with scallops. You know, there's a big fight over near England right now with fishing grounds and trying to access certain fishing areas because the UK decided to stick wind factories off the coast of Scotland, which is their rich scallop ground. Guess what's not there anymore? So they're going over to the French waters, and the French are saying, hey, get out of here. These are our waters, not yours. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? So, you know, we've got these trade-offs that are hidden here. And meanwhile, we've got over 11 million people in the US and Canada that that depend on this for drinking water. And there's an estimated 56,000 jobs that are supported by Lakes Erie and Ontario, from sport and commercial fishing to scuba diving on shipwrecks and bird watching and more. This number was near zero in 1970. 56,000 jobs. Boating is huge in the Great Lakes Basin, the top region in the country, and New York is number 7 nationally for boat registrations. Most are located in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario ports. There will be no-go navigation zones, and it won't be done by the developer, and it won't be done by the Coast Guard. That's going to be dictated by the North American Electrical Energy Reliability Corporation, NERC. Because part of the deal in getting an interconnect is being able to secure your site. So they can tell you, we don't have any plans for it. That's part of the conditions to get an interconnect. Don't let them fool you. But now let's get into what we're going to talk about here. Offshore wind carries a capital cost of $5,486 a kilowatt. In upstate New York, that's actually 21% higher. In order to build out 9,000 megawatts of capacity, it's going to cost us almost $50 billion. When you look at the cost of a megawatt hour at $120.52 for wind energy, when right now the hydropower that we're rich with costs only $20 a megawatt, who's going to pay that bill? You know, when you look at the amount of electricity that's generated by a wind factory, the amount of zero, and this is from the New York Independent Systems Operators, 26 hours and change. Less than 10 megawatts is 7.74 days. Less than 25 megawatts, 17.8 days. Less than 100 watts, 68 days. Less than 30% of their nameplate capacity is over 2/3 of the year. They only act like a power plant, delivering 60% of their capacity for maybe 8 or 9 days. Versus 7,000 unpowered dams that we could power up hydro. Across New York State, according to the Department of Energy 2015 survey, we have 7,000 unpowered dams that at 50% of the cost can be powered up. They're geographically spread out, so we're not losing electricity due to Ohm's law and friction. And a hydro plant across the board, there's 0 hours of zero production, 0 hours of less than 10 megawatts of production, 0 hours of less than 25, 0 hours of less than 100. In fact, they produce 43% of the time between 30% and 60% of nameplate capacity, and 58% of the time, over 211 days, delivers over 60% of what they're rated to do to the grid every single day. Now I ask you, is it wise to build wind factories in our fresh water? To pay such an incredible price, a capitalized cost of over $6,000 a kilowatt? Who's going to pay for that? Will it actually deliver based on production? Absolutely not. We're going to get absolutely nothing for this, except a much higher bill and a lake that is a heck of a lot less rich in a whole bunch of things. I want you all to think about that and take that message home with you. Thank you very much.